Hi class, Miss Stevens here again. This is video number 4 in our Industrial Revolution unit. The preceding videos we had a look at what medieval society was like and how there were the roots of the Industrial Revolution emerging in that pre-industrial society. Today's video is about the Agricultural Revolution and how that contributed to the ability for an Industrial Revolution to occur. So there is a bit of a debate about why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain as opposed to any other European country or other country around the world. And one of the most significant arguments put forward for why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain is that there was first an agricultural revolution. So in the Middle Ages, if you remember from last time, there were lots of farmers who used hand tools. They weren't really able to produce large amounts of food. They worked common land and they rented or owned small strips of farmland. They gathered wood and other resources from common land and the forests around their village. But in the 1700s, an agricultural revolution begins and it creates conditions that favour an industrial revolution. So we see some new ideas and new methods coming forward, like farmers beginning to grow new kinds of crops and using new kinds of technology. There is a gradual increase in food production, which leads on to improving people's health, obviously as a result of their improved diet, and that then contributes to population growth. There was also more efficient farming methods being introduced, like enclosing land, which we're going to look at a bit later, which meant that there were fewer people needed to carry out farming work. And as a result of all these new things, new crops and technology, increased food, and the use of farm fences, we end up having an increase in the number of unemployed farmers. Now they need work, they need to support their families, but they need to look elsewhere for employment. And so what we have is this huge labour force that is sort of ready and waiting for some kind of industry. And so now we're going to have a look at tracing through what exactly each of these points means in detail. So the open field system. In around 1700, about half the farms in Britain were still following farming practices of the Middle Ages. It's called the open field system or the three-field system. Now this traditional farming method provides only enough produce for the inhabitants of the village. There's some left over which they pay in taxes, but they're not really making much surplus food. And so what we see in this system is farms are divided into 3 separate fields. If you have a look over here, we have the spring planting, the fall or autumn planting, and then a fallow field. Now, what we have is a rotation around these 3 fields. So they only use this one in spring, for instance, this one in autumn, and this one has nothing planted in it. And then the next year, the one that was for spring planting becomes the autumn planting, the field that becomes the spring planting, and the one that had the fall or autumn planting becomes the empty field. So it rotates around. Now they would use the fallow field to provide space for their cows and sheep to graze, and obviously they would be dropping their dung on that field, and that would be contributing to fertilizing the field. There was also common land that was used by people of the village. So here we have a common pasture. We also have the forest, which was accessible, a meadow, and an orchard. And all of these areas were accessible by people in the village. So between 80 and 90% of the farming land was owned by wealthy landowners, and they leased this land back to the farmers. And we saw this in an earlier video when we were talking about feudalism. Sometimes we have squatters who are very poor people who are allowed to stay on the land, but they don't actually own any land. There's quite a few disadvantages to this kind of system. It's quite inefficient to begin with because 1/3 of all your planting area is left empty every single year. Having animals wandering all over your planting areas in your fields can lead to diseases being spread. We also have farmers being very much subject to the decisions of their wealthy landowners. And there's not really much opportunity for people to try new things because they rely so heavily for their survival on the outcome of each year's harvest that they're not willing to risk anything going wrong. But over time, what we get is a change. And so we end up with the enclosed field system. Partly this occurs as a result of some changes in laws in England. And what it means is that they enclose the fields, or in other words, put fences around the fields. You can see here a stone fence, which is a remnant of a pre-industrial fence. Here's some more fences. Sometimes they use what we would recognize as a fence, and sometimes they use hedges, which you can see up here. Now, the good thing about this is that it keeps pastures separated. It keeps animals and even people out of particular farming areas. And part of this system means that wealthy landowners end up rearranging and combining those smaller strips of land to form bigger farms. And from the 1740s, there were changes in the law that meant that landowners were actually forced to use the enclosed field system in England. So smaller farms were slowly combined to form bigger ones, and there was no more common land. Smaller farms end up being bought off poorer farmers who can't afford to pay for fences and a team of oxen to work the land, which was part of the enclosure laws. And tenant farmers or renting farmers, those who couldn't prove they owned any land or didn't own any land to begin with, were no longer needed, and they were no longer allowed to stay on the land. If we have a look a little bit more detail about the way you rotate crops. So I've got here for you 4 different kind of crops that were common in the pre-industrial and agricultural revolution period. So clover is basically grass. Turnips or other kinds of root vegetables, but turnips in this period were common. We have barley and wheat. So what we end up having is this idea of rotating crops, and each of them contributes to the fertility of the soil. So when you plant clover, you've got something for your animals to eat. You replace nitrates and different kinds of minerals and things that different crops need. And so what we end up getting is something like this. And you can see here crops are being rotated around the various plots. So what it means is that we end up having land that's a lot more productive because the fallow field is no longer left empty. We have increased fertility in the soil, which again means that you can plant more crops more frequently. And when you're using all of your land, you can take the risk to try something new, to innovate, and know that you're not going to starve because you've still got some of your land producing crops, whilst others might be sort of testing out a new idea. And of course, they very quickly realize that some of these new ideas work really, really well. The other thing that is introduced during the Agricultural Revolution is new farming techniques to do with animals. And so when you're enclosing your farm, obviously it's a benefit to wealthy farm owners. And the thing that comes out of this is that really when you get a big farm, you can't really work these farms by hand as much as they previously were able to do. And so once they figure out that they don't need to leave fields fallow, they end up making more money and more profit. And they invest that profit into new ideas and particularly new farming machines. So wealthy landowners end up using new techniques to extend and improve their fields. They experiment with things like draining marshlands, with irrigating, enriching poor soils with fertilizers like nitrogen, and they also experiment with the idea of controlling insects. They also try scientific methods of seed selection and livestock breeding. And if we have a look here, the difference between what is the sort of base wild cow, and so these animals were selected based on the biggest examples or the strongest examples of whether it was cattle, sheep, pigs, or horses, and they select particular animals to mate with other particular animals. And this leads to crossbreeding, where they can breed in the particular characteristics that they're after, whether it is that you've got sheep that produce more wool, or cows that produce more milk, or animals that produce more meat, or birds that produce more eggs. And so we get a change in the kinds of animals that farmers are able to work with. For example, in 1710, the average weight of cattle was 168 kilos, but by 1795, it was 363 kilos. So a massive change in such a short period of time just due to selective breeding. The other thing that they end up having a look at is labour-saving devices. And the introduction of sturdier implements made of iron instead of wood, for example, like this one here, the triangular plough. So its design shape is different, and it's also made of metal rather than wood, so it can get the job done faster and more effectively. Other inventions include things like this one here, which was called the seed drill. And so up here in the funnel, you've got a whole stack of seeds. They're being put into the ground down here in this little chute. And here is the plough, and the person is pushing it along. And this is a much less labour-intensive way of sowing seed for crops. So when we've got more land under production, we've got selective breeding to produce higher yields, we end up getting massive increases in agricultural output. And this means it's possible to feed much more people. And we get the cycle of a healthier diet, a rapid increase in population, therefore an increase in the demand for food, therefore landowners being able to sell products for more money, therefore making more profit, which allows them to further innovate and further selectively breed. And so in this period, for the first time, there's a massive surplus of food available for sale, and it's produced by a much smaller number of people. So what this means is that the revolution in agriculture, or the changes to farming, made the revolution in industry possible. And when we have all these people surviving, but also not being needed to work on farms, we end up getting the rise of cheap labour. So this combination of an increasing population with more efficient farming techniques and the reducing need for labour means that we've got a massive class of people who are out of work. These people have often lost their land and their livelihood, and so they have to move from the country and into the city. And here's a cartoon where you can see the idea of lots and lots of people coming in the country and moving into the city. Now, this huge increase in the population moving to urban or city centres, combined with population growth, means that there is a massive competition for jobs. People end up getting pretty desperate. They're willing to work for very long hours for low wages in bad conditions. And so when industry begins to really develop a lot more in Britain, there's plenty of cheap labour available to do the work. And in this graph here, you can see the massive increases just across 50 years of how many people are living in city centres instead of the country.